In many cases, the attempt, the remake in many cases is an attempt to find a way of remaking the material. Those are usually the cases that we care about the most. So for example, in the recent film Joker, there's an origin story about how the Joker became the Joker. And it's not a simple remake of the Joker story where it's a result of falling into a vat of chemicals. There's an attempt to give it a kind of psychological motivation. So it's not simply a remake. It's trying to discover a new angle. So that I think in that case we tend to think of it as more artistically interesting. There are other cases where there just seem to be bold updates, making it in black and white with the battles between the superheroes staged digitally, so that things that were almost beyond the reach of earlier filmmakers are achieved. Those I tend to think we think of less of. But in terms of the other approach that I just suggested, where you try and give new emphasis on old material, that's something that we value across the arts. After all, one of the reasons that we're interested in hearing different orchestras and different musicians play different works, especially in the classical canon, is that we hope that they'll bring out different cultures or different features in the work. So in a good remake, what we look for is an attempt to maybe ring a different angle in terms of the original material. And I think we think less of the remakes that just seem to be copies or almost replicas for basically financial purposes, right? Because people know the title, and we even actually call these things franchises now for that reason. Well, in an ideal world, you would see it more than once. When I was a critic, there were some sorts of things that it wouldn't have been possible to see more than once, especially avant-garde performance art. I mean, it might be a one-night sort of thing. I think probably it would be, better for movie critics to have the opportunity to see more than once. Of course, now they do have the opportunity to not only see it in previews, but to then refresh their memories by looking at screeners. So things are a little better than they used to be. But there's only world enough in time, and given their schedules and the amount of things they have to review, sometimes people are only going to be able to see it once. The problems with movie criticism, though, that's not the biggest problem with movie criticism. I think the biggest problem with movie criticism is that a lot of movie critics, not all, but a lot of movie critics regard themselves as consumer consultants. So what they take their task to be is to tell what they think of as their audience, whether or not they would like to go and see it. So they're almost like armchair pollsters or armchair sociologists trying to guess what people will like. I think that certainly is the the wrong approach. I mean, what they should be doing is the same as I'm advocating other appreciators and critics to do, which is to try to identify what the point of the work is, and then look at how the filmmaker tried to realize that purpose. Look at a film like Vertigo. Look at the early scenes where Scotty is following who he thinks is Madeline, and how those scenes are designed. And for example, remember when he follows her into the flower shop. He walks down this dark, dank, kind of brownish alleyway, and he opens the door, and then bang, there are all of these flowers. And that's Hitchcock's kind of way of letting you into the fantasy world, letting you in on, something's just happened. This has burst into the world of color. In a way, it's kind of like a similar strategy in The Wizard of Oz. Kansas is in black and white, and when she arrives in Oz, it bursts into color. So in these cases, we see how this move from dark to a barrage of colors is a very elegant realization of by the filmmakers of this kind of entry into a land of fantasy. Well, I think that the overall purpose of the approach I'm advocating is to enhance the understanding of the film, and my point would be that by identifying the constituted purpose or purposes of a film, that would give you not only a level of understanding concerning what the film is about, it will also give you great insight into the structure and the form of the film. It will give you insight into why the artist, why the filmmaker chose to do what she chose to do. So learning the purpose of something is also reciprocally a way or a road or an avenue to understand why the thing is made the way it's made. So knowing that the purpose of something is a hiking boot tells you certain things about the reason that it's structured the way it is. It tells you why it's not a stiletto high heel, for example. I mean, it has structures, it has weight, it has firmness. It's bolstered in a way that enables it to not fall apart when it when it's put to the work of walking 25 miles a day for a month. So the purpose is something that it's valuable to know, but it also is productive of further insight into why the thing is the way it is. Why is a racing car the way it is as opposed to an SUV? They have different purposes. I don't want to comment particularly about Ebert because he's got, as far as I know, there are about four or five volumes of his collected criticism, and I don't really feel that I could actually make a generalization about it. I suppose this won't be surprising. I think when a film critic manages to explain the relation of an artist's purpose to his to his or her choices, that that's when they're doing their work. That's when they achieve what's best of all. So when somebody like Parker Tyler talks about Charlie Chaplin's outfit as the tramp, and emphasizes what each of the choices involve. For example, his clothes, his pants are too big for him. The way his bowler hat sits on his head gives him a big head. And these things all kind of remind you more of a child. And that childlikeness is important to the kind of naive view of the world the character has had. That's to me a film critic doing what he's supposed to be doing, or she's supposed to be doing at its best. On the other hand, when a film critic like the critics of this recent film Joker that we've talked about worry that it's going to incite young men who are called incels to violence, it seems to me that they're not involved in actually telling us about the choices that the artist has made, that the filmmakers made. They're actually involved with speculating about things that they have virtually no evidence for. I think that probably the answer to that is no, in the sense that very often when people say mirrors the mind, what they mean is what the filmmaker is consciously trying to do. I think that very often we're not conscious of what we're trying to do, but nevertheless it is what we're trying to do. So, for example, many filmmakers would say of film noirs in the 40s were probably not intentionally trying to express sexist ideas with their images of femme fatales who are always betraying, you know, Burt Lancaster or Robert Mitchum, but that sexism was actually something that they were tacitly committed to because of the culture at large. That suspicion of women, that notion of the woman as a kind of manipulator, was part and part of the culture. So it was expressed, but it might be news to the director that he was expressing that idea. But it was part of, let's say, his mental set. So if, with your question about mirroring, you mean mirrors what's consciously in the director or the scriptwriter's mind, I would say no, but that doesn't mean that he isn't or she isn't expressing something that's part of the way she understands the world. Well, collaborative works, architectural works, film works, theater works. You can talk about the purposes, for example, of different contributors. For example, I was speaking to you earlier about the purpose of the costume designer in the way that he or she designed the costume for the emperor played by Joaquin Phoenix, Commodus in Gladiator. had the purpose of making a comment about his character, that he was a dandy as opposed, say, to a warrior. But that choice, of course, occurred in a larger context where there was an executive or controlling maker who had to ratify that choice, who had to say, that's right, that's correct. You know, and so in that sense, very often what we're doing is looking at the constituent purpose in terms of what, say, a controlling or an executive figure has actually mandated. But that's not to say that there aren't ways in which we can, you know, change the lens that we're examining and look at the contribution of the costumer, of the makeup artist, of the cinematographer. So it's certainly possible to talk about the purposes at different levels. And of course, it's also possible to talk about how some of the purposes at one level don't fit into the larger purpose, which we might refer to as the kind of we purpose or corporate purpose of the work. So, I mean, everybody, for example, when they talk about Citizen Kane, talks about the adaptations that Greg Toland made in terms of his use of lenses and his uses of the side lights to achieve greater depth of field. But of course, Orson Welles, as the director, ratified that usage and exploited it, as did, say, William Wyler, for example, in Best Years of Our Lives, where Teresa Wright and Dana Andrews are in the foregrounds being married, and Frederick March and his wife were in the background, to more or less use the depth that Toland afforded to make a dramatic point. So we certainly can talk about the choices that Toland made, that, let's say, I don't know if this is true, but let's say that Orson Welles didn't actually understand the mechanics of the lenses and the stoppages that Toland used. He did actually understand what it could do and incorporated its use and ratified its use in the overall production. Well, you know, it can go either way. There are some filmmakers like Stan Brakhage who do everything, and there are some filmmakers who exert more control than others. I mean, Alfred Hitchcock exerted a terrific amount of control by storyboarding the entire thing ahead of time, so that he thought the shooting part was the least of it all. And on the other hand, many fine artists employed studios, so when they made very big paintings, there would be multiple contributors, and surely in architecture there are an entire ensemble of artists. So I don't think that, film is not that different than theater in terms of how large a group you need, and then there's orchestral music where there'll be different contributions. So I think you have to look at things on a case-by-case basis. There's not a generalization you will make that says a filmmaker's task is always a film critic's task is always harder because there are more people involved. look, they may be less difficult. There are lots of people involved in an ordinary TV sitcom production, but it doesn't make it the case that a television reviewer's job is harder than the person who has to deal with the surrealist painting. That's much subtler, even though only one person has made it. Well, no, I think Roma was a terrific film. Manchester by the Sea was a terrific film. There are certain filmmakers like Fajardi who I think are always worth seeing and terrifically sophisticated. We've already mentioned What We Do in the Shadows. I mean, he's a great filmmaker. I always want to see what he does. And I thought Thor Ragnarok was very good because it was it was very kind of self-joshing. And in a way, I like Black Panther too, for the opposite reason. I mean, Black Panther was very straight. I mean, it was really, forgetting about all of this kind of self-referentiality and just being an old-time classic. So I didn't like Black Panther as much as they, or didn't think Black Panther was quite as good as people claimed. I mean, I think they exaggerated its achievement, but it was fine. But I have found a lot of the rest of them becoming too repetitive, throwing railroad trains at each other, and a 20-minute digital ending and whatever. I don't go to them all now. I mean, I used to follow them pretty closely, but I don't anymore, unless it looks like there's going to be something special about them. I mean, in terms of the Warner's version, the DC, I mean, I did like, I thought Wonder Woman until the last 20 minutes was pretty good. And as I said, I as of now, I think the Joker is pretty good. The thing that he does, one thing that Phoenix does is he does these incredibly creepy dances.
Oh, really?
I mean, they're worth it. Well, I don't know if they're worth the ticket price. The tickets are getting ridiculous, but they're pretty stunning, these dances he does. Yeah. Well, we watched Gladiator last night. He's very good in that too. And also, I hadn't realized it the first time I saw it. In terms of the kind of evaluation we're talking about, his costumes are very special. He's the only he always has a very ornate costume, but he's the only one in the film who has costumes like that. So it really portrays him as kind of being a dandy, as opposed to people like Russell Crowe who are gladiators, who are soldiers that mean really manly, versus this kind of dandy who has all this kind of fluffery on. Well, I hadn't thought about it until last night, and I hadn't seen it. The film came out in 2000, so it was almost 20 years since I had seen it. So it's one of those things you were talking about. I certainly saw something new in it, reviewing it, something I hadn't noticed the first time around. There's lots to see more than certainly when I was growing up, and a lot of it is not good, and a lot of it is good. When I was growing up, Hollywood was producing about 60 films a year, and we didn't really see that much from other countries. So I could see almost everything. No one could see all of the films being made today. And if you throw in television, I don't even think God could see it all. Well, Ghibli is magnificent. But look, there are good good animated films in the United States. What was it called? Spider-Man, the Multiverse. That's a terrific film. Well, no flies on that as far as I'm concerned. Well, I've only seen Joker once, and it's pretty impressive. As the critic Jung once, the philosopher Jung once pointed out, you have to be careful. You have to see things more than once, because sometimes the first time you see something, it's so dazzling that you think more highly of it. And actually, sometimes you see something and it's so confusing that you lower your estimate of it. So I would say right now I think the Joker was pretty impressive, especially Joaquin Phoenix's performance. But I don't know whether I've been overwhelmed by. Well, it looks terrific, and his performance is terrific. So I'd want to see it again before I gave it a definitive estimate. But as of now, I think it's pretty good, and that encourages me to want to see it again, which is a good sign.